Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Gates of Thelgrim by Robbie Macniven, narrated by Derek Shoales. Prologue. "Stay close," Tiabat told Sarah. She knew it was a stupid thing to say, because right now she was clutching Sarah's hand as tightly as possible. The little girl had no choice other than to stay close. In truth, Tiabat knew she was saying it for her own benefit as much as her daughter's. Stay close had become a sort of mantra over the past few months, all the way from their home west of Keller, on the long, brutal trek through the howling giant hills, west seeking shelter in the icy streets of Frostgate, and then northeast and beyond to the edge of the world. Stay close sometimes felt like all Tiabat had, the only form of control she could still exert in a life that, otherwise, had been wholly taken away from her. "I'm tired," Sarah complained. Tiabat did her best not to snap back at her. "Not much further now, sweetheart," she said, keeping her eyes fixed ahead. She didn't think she could carry Sarah in her arms again. In the months spent on the road with the other refugees, trying to outrun the Uthuk warbands that were spreading like the plague through eastern Terrinoth, she had seen incredible feats of endurance from parents battling to keep their children alive. She felt as though she'd carried Sarah across half of Terrinoth herself, through cloying mud and swampy tracks and thorny, cutting forests. In Frostgate, she'd given up the leather of her shoes to mend her daughters. She had walked barefoot ever since, the soles of her feet long since reduced to pads of tough, numb skin. The two of them had come so far, yet, despite it all, she wasn't sure she could carry Sarah another step. If she fell now, she knew she wouldn't be able to get up again. "You always say not much further," Sarah complained. Tiabat closed her eyes for a moment as she walked, trying to keep her voice level. "This time I really mean it. Look, you can see the end right there. It's getting closer with every step." She opened her eyes and pointed forward, over the bowed heads of those trudging in front. Beyond them the Dunwarr mountains rose like a vast curtain wall, sheer flanks of gray and purple soaring up to jagged parapets of snowy white. It seemed as though they had been set to guard the heavens themselves, framed by a cloudless sky that arched overhead from peak to flanking peak, like some vast azure vault. "We're really going there?" Sarah asked, following Tiabat's gesture. Directly ahead, further along the rocky path that the caravan had been following through the foothills, stood something that glittered gold and silver in the distance. From far out, it looked like a wall set into the base of the mountainside, a smooth block carved by cunning artifice into the jagged lower face of the peaks. Tiabat knew it wasn't a wall, though. It was a gate. "We are," she reassured Sarah, managing to smile down at her. "And we're so close now we can even see it, so not much further." How many times had she said those words lately? How many times had they been a lie, told as much to herself as to her daughter? Now, finally, they were coming true. Just a little further. The caravan trudged on. There had been about 100 of them when they'd first left Frostgate 3 weeks earlier. Now there were half that number. Some had broken off and gone to Highmont as they had skirted past the southern edges of Blind Mere Forest. Others had turned back or dropped by the wayside. Some had simply disappeared overnight. Tiabat tried not to think about those. She learned quickly how to survive on the road. You couldn't trust the people in the caravans. All of them were desperate, and desperate people did desperate things. The ones that offered to help, they were the worst of all. They always wanted a favor in return, or were just searching for the weak and vulnerable behind the guise of kindness, sifting for prey amidst the lost souls cast onto Terrinoth's roads by the war that had gripped the baronies. They were like wolves, stalking in amongst the flock, always watching, always hungry. She discovered that to her cost when an elderly man who'd looked after Sarah on several occasions while she'd been bartering for food had robbed her while she slept. Now she avoided the helpers, avoided those with the distant stares, and the ones who muttered constantly under their breath. She spoke to no one and instructed Sarah to do the same. "Stay close," she urged her once more. Sarah clung on, though Tiabat could see how her small steps faltered. "Not now," she silently urged. "Not when they're so close." The gates were more clearly visible now. Tiabat tried to focus on them, seeking anything that could help take her mind off the stiff, trembling exhaustion in her limbs or the aching pit of hunger in her stomach. She could see an arch of carved rock rising above the huge entranceway, its sheer size only becoming apparent the nearer they got. Towers and ramparts had been carved directly into the steep slopes to their side, seemingly spouting fully formed from the rock face. So well designed it was difficult to tell where mountain ended and fortress began. The gates themselves stood partially open, the sunlight gleaming brilliantly from the burnished metal cladding them. Tiabet realized, as the caravan drew gradually closer, that they had been fashioned in the likeness of two huge Dunwarr warriors, standing back to back, as though warding off surrounding foes in the midst of the mountain pass. Even with the entrance still at a distance, the sheer scale of the architecture almost made her falter and lose her footing. She realized that the track, for so long a rutted, stony pathway winding unevenly through the foothills, had been replaced with a more solid road of carefully laid, interlocking cobbles, worn smooth by the passage of countless feet. The valley was likewise constricting ever more sharply on either side of them, its flanks rising above to block out the sunlight, while leaving it shining down upon the great gate ahead of them, making it gleam like a beacon in the gloom.
"Will we get to see the dwarfs, ma'am?" Sarah asked her. "The ones who live under the mountains?"
"Yes, sweetheart," Tiabet said, too distracted to reply properly. There was a change in the movement up ahead, or rather, a lack of it. The family of 5 directly in front of them, a husband and wife, their parents, and their infant son, had all come to a stumbling halt, blocked by a covered wagon carrying sacks of supplies. Something somewhere down the line had stalled. That in itself was hardly unusual. It seemed that every hour a cart would throw a wheel or one of the oxen would falter and fall. The whole procession would then shuffle to a halt as people argued and cursed one another. Eventually, whatever had caused the delay would either be fixed or simply hauled off the roadway and abandoned, and the ponderous line would get underway again. Tiabet usually kept to the side whenever there was a halt. Tempers always rose, and she'd seen enough blood spilled and thoughtless anger over the last few months to know it wasn't worth getting involved in the crowd that always gathered around whatever was causing the obstruction. Today, however, was different. Today the end was in sight, achingly close. After everything they'd been through, to be able to see the gates themselves, it was too much. She felt her anger flare. "Stay close," she repeated, keeping hold of Sarah's hand as she led her off to one side, into the cold lee of the sheer slopes flanking the road. She was trying to get a better view of whatever had caused the caravan to stop, but others had already had a similar idea. Bodies blocked the route up to the gates, voices rising as a sense of agitation swept through the huddled groups of refugees.
"Why are we stopping?"
Sarah asked, standing on her tiptoes as she strained for a better view. "We aren't," Tiabet corrected her, leading her along the side of the road. From Keller to the very base of the Dunwarrs, she hadn't struggled half the length of Terrinoth just to be stopped by some fat sutler's broken wagon axle. The press of bodies grew rapidly denser. The gates were soaring just ahead now, the scars of 1,000 sieges visible in the huge, elaborately crafted metal bands that protected the entranceway. The voices around Tiabet were rising as well, competing with the shouting now audible from ahead. It appeared to be coming from the gates themselves. There was no obstruction, she realized, not on the road anyway. The caravan had met with another that appeared to have been stalled right in front of the gates themselves. A short slope led up to the final approach, and the raised elevation allowed Tiabet to see over the heads of those crowding in front. The gates were still open, but the route through them had been blocked. A solid phalanx of Dunwarr warriors stood like a wedge between the two halves of the entranceway, the mountain sun gleaming brilliantly from burnished helmets and metal-banded shields. One of their number had come forward, taking up a position a few paces ahead of the front ranks. She seemed to be in conversation with a gaggle of refugees, presumably the leaders of the caravan that had arrived just before Tiabet's. Their voices were raised, but the hubbub of the intervening crowd masked their actual words.
"They're going to bar the gates,"
an old woman in a ragged shawl next to Tiabet exclaimed.
"They're going to lock us out."
"Nonsense,"
snapped a heavy-set man dressed in a fur-lined red merchant's tunic, glaring back at the woman.
"The Dunwarr have been accepting refugees for months. They wouldn't just stop today."
"You can't know that for sure,"
called out another voice, unseen amongst the gathering. The claim drew out more voices, rising and melding together in an angry, confused outcry. Tiabet felt the same rising swell of panic that was infecting those around her, twinned with a desperate hope that she was mistaken. Surely something like this couldn't really be happening.
"What's going on, ma'am?"
Sarah pleaded, tugging on Tiabet's hand. She shushed her, trying to follow what was happening at the gates. One of the refugees, an elf, was throwing his arms up angrily. He turned and stormed back towards the crowd, as several of the human delegates seemed to try to push past the dwarf they'd been conferring with. There was a general swaying motion amongst the bodies around Tiabet. She felt herself being thrust forward, shoving, jostling refugees, beginning to force those at the front of the slope and towards the Dunwarr ranks. "Hold on," Tiabet shouted to her daughter, trying to keep her close. It seemed as though the crowd was going to surge up into the dwarfs, heedless of their presence barring their way. That was when a voice rang out, deep and commanding. It was accompanied by the single peal of a mountain horn, unseen, echoing sharply down the valley. The dwarves ahead reacted immediately. Shields were brought up and slammed together, creating a fearsome, echoing report that sounded from the slopes on either side. At the same time, the second rank shifted. Tiabet caught sight of crossbows being raised, poised between the overlapping shields of the Dunwarrian front. They were loaded, the wicked tips of the quarrels gleaming. A wail went up from the crowd as those at the front urgently began to push back against the one shoving forward from behind. Sarah screamed as she was almost dragged from Tiabet's grip. She clung onto her daughter with both hands, pulling her in close as they were both nearly lifted from their feet by the diverging currents driving the crowd. There was another horn blast, ringing through the cold, clear air. People around Tiabet were crying and screaming now, total panic overwhelming the refugees as the sound of vast, rumbling hinges rose above the discord. With another shuddering crash, the Dunwarr phalanx moved. They took a step back, shield wall staying intact and crossbows never wavering. Another step, then another, the darkness beyond the door slowly swallowing them up. As they went, the vast gates began to swing steadily shut, the sunlight catching the scarred metal.
"No!"
Tiabet shouted as she was driven further back by the crowd, her hopes plummeting as a sense of absolute helplessness gripped her. She tried to free herself from the press, but it was no use. All she could do was cling on to her daughter and attempt to shield her from the shoving, stumbling, shouting mass. With a crash that seemed to shake the very mountain peaks above them, the gates of Thelgrim slammed shut. Chapter 1. The man named Slevchik slammed his fist into the table, spilling ale and scattering coins across a scratched, sticky timber.
"Cheat!"
he bellowed, glaring furiously at Wraithen. The dwarf returned an equally fierce look, his single dark eye glinting in the sallow candlelight of the taproom. "Piece of advice, manling," he said. "It's not clever to accuse someone of cheating at cards when they've just beaten you. It makes you look like a bad loser, which, I'll grant, you probably are. But for future reference, if you're going to sling mud, do it while you're ahead. The second round we played, perhaps, or the third, while you were still winning. It makes it more believable, more honest-looking." Wraithen wasn't sure if anything he just said had reached Slevchik's admittedly small brain. The heavy-set merchant was practically steaming with fury, his fists bunched, jaw clenched, ruddy complexion turning an even uglier shade of puce. His compatriots, two other human traders sitting to his left and right, seemed caught between their desire to back up their friend and their aversion to making a scene in the middle of the bar. In Wraithen's private opinion, it was a bit late for that. The tap room beneath Skellig's Inn had gone deadly quiet, as carousers turned their attention expectantly towards where Wraithen and his fellow gamblers were sitting. The dispute had been rumbling all evening, as Slevchik became ever more drunk and belligerent. He'd mocked Wraithen's earlier setbacks, then reacted with increasing outrage as the dwarf had first won back his losses, then started steadily building on them. Of course, the oafish human was quite correct. Wraithen had been cheating. Nothing especially nuanced, but naturally the pack was rigged. Wraithen had a few duplicates he'd palmed, with a backup barony queen concealed beneath a platter of half-eaten poultry wings he'd been deliberately taking his time with.
"Never trusted Dunwarr when it comes to gold," Slevchik spat across the table, cuffing drool from his chin stubble. "Especially a one-eyed, one-handed one."
Making such a remark toward a dwarf would normally have seen the human skull smashed by a bar stool or an axe, but Wraithen had heard it all before. Besides, he was no ordinary Dunwarr. He smiled. "Come now, manling, we're three apiece. If I'm cheating, I'm not doing a very good job of it," he said. "You've won all the big bets," whined one of Slevchik's companions, a sniveling, sunken-eyed little man whose name Wraithen hadn't bothered to remember. I wasn't the one who started raising the stakes, he pointed out. That's down to you three gentlemen. He could feel the attention of the rest of the bar on them, a fact Slevchuk and his friends seemed oblivious to. Right now, that was the only variable Rathan felt vaguely uncomfortable about. He could keep these three idiots going all night, but what if someone else intervened? What if one of the other patrons had seen the trick before, or just possessed a keener eye and a clearer head than the human trio? He noted the presence of two elves earlier in the evening, and one of the bar servers had been staring at him for the better part of an hour, even before Slevchuk's outrage had started to draw a more general crowd. He feared it wasn't because of his good looks either.
"The hand!"
Slevchuk exclaimed, gesturing furiously.
"The hand is fake!"
Rathan made a show of sighing heavily. "We've been over this," he said, making sure he was speaking loudly enough to be overheard by the rest of the taproom. "Yes, the hand is fake. No, I've not stuffed cards or coins in it. Look." He grasped the wooden prop with his other hand and unbuckled it, removing it from the sleeve of his green cloak. "Solid fair oak," he said, tossing it across the table. "Inspect it for yourself, again." Slevchuk snatched the carved object and squinted at it, blinking rapidly as he tried to focus through his inebriation. He let out a grunt of frustration and tossed it to the accomplice on his right, who turned it over in his own hands, searching for some sign of duplicity. "If you're quite done, I'd appreciate it back," Rathan said, holding his good hand out. "Perhaps we can also stop insulting and harassing an old dwarf and get back to the game, unless you manlings would rather call it a night."
"I want my money back,"
Slevchuk barked, hitting the table again as his friend reluctantly passed Rathan his replacement limb. "You can win it back," the dwarf said brightly, refastening the hand. "What do you say to one more round? All or nothing."
"Liar!"
Slevchuk bellowed, attempting to rise from his seat, but falling back into it instead. He fumbled at his belt and drew a long, lean bullock dagger, the candlelight winking from his slender blade.
"Give me my money!"
Rathan reached out with his good hand and snatched the front of Slevchuk's jerkin. Ignoring the knife, he hauled him forward so he was planted firmly against the table's edge, knocking over a flagon of ale and scattering coins and cards as he did so. "I didn't lie about the hand, you stupid manling," he snarled. "It's solid, but I do just happen to have a third one, and it's currently pointing a loaded hand bow at your manhood underneath the table. So, settle down, smile, and play one more round, and you won't be spending the rest of the night trying to pluck a quarrel from the only treasure that really matters. Agreed?" Rathan fixed Slevchuk's eyes with his own, their faces inches apart. The stink of unwashed, intoxicated idiot manling almost more than the dwarf could bear. He saw the slow, pained realization in Slevchuk's bleary gaze, giving way to the spark of outrage. "Choose your next words very wisely, my friend," he urged. This was the decisive moment, the one he'd been expecting since he'd first offered the three merchants a game. Either Slevchuk would accept what was happening and would be walking out of Skelligs unharmed, but with a lighter purse, or Rathan was about to be forced to make a hasty exit of his own with the money he'd made thus far. The ace up his sleeve, not quite literally in this case, was the false hand he sometimes employed to confound opponents. An extra sleeve was sewn into his heavy green cloak, concealing his real arm and hand, while the focus of those across from him remained on his wooden prosthetic. His finger tightened fractionally on the hand bow he was grasping below the table. Play the odds right, and 9 times out of 10 you'd come out on top.
"Rathan,"
said a voice shattering the moment. Still gripping the front of the merchant's tunic, both Rathan and Slevchuk look up, slowly. While the dwarf had been trying to get his point across, a hulking bear of a man had approached their table. He was clad in a fur-edged cloak, his head shaved, a huge bristling mustache drooping down almost to his chest. He loomed over the table, looking pointedly at Rathan.
"You're late,"
he rumbled. Rathan let go of the tunic abruptly, letting Slevchuk slump back in his chair. With practiced speed, he began to unload and conceal the crossbow beneath the table, all the while smiling up at the big man. "You know, Kayfern, I was actually early. Couldn't find you anywhere, though, so I thought I'd entertain these fine fellows until I spotted you. I suppose I lost track of time. My apologies." He finished with a hand bow as he spoke, slipping it into his rucksack. Kayfern grunted. He seemed oblivious to the attention much of the bar was giving him. The big human was practically a minor celebrity in parts such as these, a well-known face in the taverns and inns that crammed their way along Frostgate's icy streets.
Well, if you still want a job beyond tavern pickpocketing, I suggest you come with me, he said. Now.
Absolutely, Rathan said, rising and offering a short bow to the merchants. Duty calls, I'm afraid. Slevchuk rose unsteadily to confront the interloper, and Rathan couldn't help but smirk as he saw the man's anger turn to dismay as he realized he barely came up to Kayfern's chin.
I would sit down if I were you, Slevchuk, Kayfern said. Enjoy the last of your ale and go home quietly to your wife.
He extended a hand to Slevchuk's shoulder as he spoke, patting it. Slevchuk once more fell back into his chair. Avoiding making eye contact with anyone else, Rathan swept his winnings into his sack, slung it over his shoulder, and followed Kayfern through the taproom into a small space through the back of the bar. It had once been a pantry, but its shelves were now empty and thick with dust, the only sign of its former use a few old sacks of meal still heaped in one corner. A single table and 4 chairs filled the cramped space, lit by a lonely, festering tallow candle. Kayfern sat across from the door, his chair creaking beneath his weight. Rathan hesitated before taking the seat opposite. They were not the only two in the room. A woman was already at the table, looking decidedly bored as she passed a small stone shard between her fingers. She was dressed in an embroidered golden coat that turned to long, flowing pleats below the waist, worn over a silken white shirt with flared sleeves. Her hair was long and dark, plaited down her back and held away from her forehead by a red and gold wrap. Bangles and charms decorated her wrists, and a carved bone staff was propped casually against a chair behind her, topped by a shard of blue tanzanite that seemed to shimmer like the ocean depths. Her face was lean and sharp, like a hawk's. Rathan could practically feel the sorcery bleeding off her. I didn't know we'd have company, he said.
Sit,
growled Kayfern. He obeyed. The woman slipped the shard she'd been toying with into the pocket of a bag strapped around her waist. Rathan looked at her directly. Can I be the first to say what an honor it is to be in the presence of a rune witch? He asked. You know me, she replied, her accent thick. If she was surprised, she didn't show it. Every adventurer worth employing has heard of the great Astara, Greyhaven's finest protégé, Rathan said, smiling at her. I dislike you already, the sorceress said. Rathan laughed. Being disliked was hardly a break from the norm for him.
Astara, this is Rathan, formerly of the Dunwarr city of Thelgrim, Kayfern said. He will be joining you on the expedition.
Will he indeed? Rathan asked, turning his attention back to Kayfern. That's good to know. Last I heard, Rathan had only expressed mild interest in finding out why the great Kayfern had put a call out in the bars and taverns of Frostgate for Rathan to join him.
I know you well enough, dwarf, Kayfern said. I know that when you start preying on fat, drunken merchants and skelligs, it means your coin pouch is empty. My employer is offering to change that. You'll take the job.
That all depends, Rathan said.
The money is good.
That's a start, but I was rather wondering about the company.
If you know of Astara, you will know of her abilities,
Kayfern said, nodding briefly to the woman. Exactly, Rathan said, and I suspect those abilities probably don't come cheap. So just what sort of task is dire enough to see your mystery employer paying out to hire a rune witch? And, more importantly, who else are we still waiting for? I was wondering that myself, Astara said. 4 chairs, Rathan added, nodding to the last unoccupied seat. The room had clearly been set up for the meeting, and he knew their host well enough to be certain he wouldn't have accidentally sat out extra spaces. Kayfern said nothing. He was a well-known facilitator in the northern baronies, a go-to between the rogues, malcontents, and bravados that populated places like the free city of Frostgate, and those who wished to employ them anonymously for work across Terrinoth. Rathan had been contracted by him 4 times previously, though whether the person actually paying him had been the same one or a different client each time, he had no idea. What mattered was that Kayfern always paid up in full when the time came. He clearly chose his employers carefully, and in this sort of business, that counted for a lot. The facilitator didn't answer Rathan's question. Instead, he looked pointedly past him towards the door. Rathan twisted in his chair as it opened. A tall figure stepped inside, forced to duck under the mantel. By the dirty light of the candle, his immediate appearance was nightmarish. He was achingly gaunt and pale, his skin seemingly stretched too tightly over a jagged skull. His ears came not to 1 point, but 3, and his eyes were black as fresh pitch, sunken into his bony face. He was clad in raggedy dark robes and had manacles fastened around his wrists and throat. His only visible ornamentation was a large, strange-looking key hanging from his waist. Wraithen reached for the axe under his cloak as Astara surged to her feet. Only Kayfern didn't react, and when he spoke it was without concern.
"Welcome, Shiver."
What in the name of Kelos's holy flame is this?
Astara demanded, lifting her staff. Her eyes had gone wide, and her knuckles white where she gripped the arcane conduit. The figure that had caused such a reaction, a deep elf, Wraithen realized, looked at her without a hint of emotion, though he felt the temperature in the pantry plummet, as though a window had just been opened directly onto the icy streets outside. His breath started fogging in front of him.
"This is the third member of the expedition,"
Kayfern said, as though it was the most obvious thing in all of Minara.
"His name is Shiver. Like the rest of you, he was chosen specifically by my employer."
He's a dark sorcerer, Astara snapped, apparently sensing the interloper's aura. What are you, creature? A necromancer? A slave to the infernal?
You are Kayfern?
The elf asked the big man, ignoring Astara. His voice was hoarse and scratchy, as though unaccustomed to use. Kayfern nodded.
"That I am. My employer thanks you for answering his call."
I do not know your employer,
Shiver said,
but I have seen you enough in my dreams to know this path is the one I am bound to tread.
He grasped the back of the last unoccupied chair and pulled it out with a long, slow scrape. Astara was still on her feet. Her staff had started to glow a cold blue. Wraithen cleared his throat and reached over to his false hand, beginning to unbuckle it. "I can do magic too," he said pointedly, removing it and freeing his real hand, which he placed flat on the table next to the other. "See, if we're going to have a sorceress duel in a tiny closet, I should warn you both, I won't hold back." Kayfern laughed. Astara looked from Shiver to Wraithen, but the tension was broken. Slowly the light of her staff started to fade. Wraithen noted that he could no longer see his breath either. "Aren't you going to chastise the elf for being late?" he asked Kayfern. The manling ignored him, though Shiver turned his black gaze on him.
I was waylaid several times, he rasped. Waking visions.
"Oh, well, that's all right then," Wraithen said. "Perhaps Kayfern can get on with telling us why we're here, and I can get on with rejecting his offer of a job with either of you two." Kayfern looked pointedly at Astara. She sat, though she kept her staff in one hand.
I don't work with dark sorcerers, she said, looking hard at Shiver. I have learned enough over the years to know that death stalks all those who do. No good will come of it.
"Shiver is not a dark sorcerer," Kayfern said. "My employer does not pay those who dally with the unnatural arts."
"He feels like one, and he looks like one," Astara pressed.
"And I look like a completely trustworthy, honest Dunwarr ranger, but I'm not," Wraithen snapped, beginning to lose his temper. "Now I didn't come to this lovely establishment in this wonderful city just to sit and debate the philosophies of magic. So could we please get to the point, Kayfern?" The facilitator looked at him silently for a moment before starting to speak.
"A month ago, Thelgrim, ancient city of the Dunwars, closed its gates. Since then, there has been no contact whatsoever with the inhabitants. No one has entered, and no one has left. All lesser entrances and exits into the mountains also appear to have been closed. The city has been sealed off."
I had heard the Dunwars had grown silent, Astara said. But if you want to know why, perhaps just ask the Dunwar sitting opposite you.
Wraithen scoffed. "I can assure you, if I was in any way privy to the thoughts of Ragnarsson and the other short-sighted fools who rule that place, I would not be here right now," he lied. He had no intention of elaborating on his knowledge regarding the king's mindset. "I haven't set foot in Thelgrim in almost 20 years.
"None know why the city has been shut off," Kayfern said. "My employer has asked far and wide and has received no satisfactory answer. That is why he has brought you together."
"No," Wraithen interrupted. The trio all looked at him. He kept his eye fixed on Kayfern. "If your master thinks I'm going back to Thelgrim, he hasn't done his research," he went on. "I thought you knew me better, Kayfern."
"You have unfinished business there," the manling said. "That is why you will go. And this." He planted a bulging leather purse down on the table. It clinked heavily. "That's just the initial payment," he said. "My employer promises more once the contract is completed." It'll be enough that you don't have to spend your evenings robbing drunken oafs in stinking, dirty taverns and
Sample complete. Ready to continue?